Why did the American colonies break away from the British? Many blame taxes, but the truth is more complex. Britain's exploration and colonization of the eastern coast of the modern United States happened in a more relaxed manner since the government wanted to avoid investing significant resources, and individual parties ranging from joint stock companies to proprietors showed interest. Throughout the 17th century, the relationship worked for both parties. Most colonial charters allowed relative autonomy for settlers, giving the people the ability to make decisions about legislation, defense, and taxation. Colonists formed governments based on their charters and growing needs. The charters allowed the people to experiment with and learn about constitutionalism as their expanding structures of government and rights became essential to their societies. In times of defense, the control of militias and soldiers' protection fell to the colonial legislatures. Britain reaped the benefits of resources for its mercantilist or self-sustaining economy, with little cost since the colonies ran themselves. The British lived in a competitive Europe, and the French had long set their sights on North America. France allied with some Native Americans and established a series of forts along the western frontier, helping give them a North American foothold, especially around the Ohio River. Colonial suspicions grew into direct contact with the Virginia Militia's expedition under Lieutenant Colonel George Washington. A skirmish took place, after which Washington retreated and quickly built Fort Necessity. He surrendered, but the French released him. Fort Necessity and other interactions increased military activity, leading to the French and Indian War. The French had the advantage because of the fortified front and better use of alliances. Leader of the House of Commons and future Prime Minister William Pitt relied on British financial advantages and borrowing to increase supplies and capability. As the war spread to multiple theaters worldwide, including Europe where it was known as the 7 Years' War, the British overcame the French. In the Treaty of 1763, France lost its place as a prominent world rival of Britain, especially in North America. They withdrew from the Ohio River Valley. France ceded Canada, meaning French-speaking people became subjects of Britain. The Mississippi River served as a border between British and Spanish territories. While France regained North American land after the War for Independence, it lost decades of possible development. The creation of public policy occurs when there is a concern or problem that needs addressing. The treaty handled the issue with the French, but unresolved friction existed with Native Americans. Some fought on the side of the British and others with the French, but unease was traced to the continual push westward of colonists. The British attempted to stop friction between settler and local populations with little success. They alienated those who had fought on the French side. Tension boiled over when Ottawa leader Pontiac coordinated attacks on British positions, capturing or destroying multiple forts. The Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III of Great Britain, prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains to reduce disputes with Native Americans. It attempted to establish a boundary between the British colonies and Native American territories and to prevent further encroachment on their lands. An additional stipulation required colonists to move eastward, out of the reserved territory. Many colonists who felt it limited their land speculation and economic growth opportunities resisted the effort. Despite the proclamation, Native American suspicion and resistance continued with Pontiac's War, which lasted until 1766. The French and Indian War and continued defense of the colonies led Prime Minister George Grenville to re-evaluate the Navigation Acts of 1651, which established high taxes on foreign goods. The legislation attempted to discourage negative impact on Britain's balance of trade, one of the goals of mercantilism. It also meant the colonies generally avoided direct taxes. Grenville revised the Molasses Act of 1733, drafting the Sugar Act of 1764. The claim of excessive taxes, which became popular rhetoric in the late 18th century, did not explain the hurtful nature of the move on sweeteners, since higher taxes in England meant less sympathy for the Americans. The ripple effect of reduced rum and necessary ingredients impacted New England's economy. Vice Admiralty courts prosecuted smugglers without a trial by jury. Enforcing laws and taxes on the colonies contradicted the self-governing nature of the individual legislatures. James Otis of Boston wrote The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. In it, he declared, "The colonists will have an equitable right, notwithstanding any such forfeiture of charter, to be represented in Parliament, or to have some new subordinate legislature among themselves. It would be best if they had both. Deprived, however, of their common rights as subjects, they cannot lawfully be, while they remain such." A representation in Parliament from the several colonies, since they are become so large and numerous, as to be called on not to maintain provincial government, civil and military among themselves, for this they have cheerfully done, but to contribute towards the support of a national standing army, by reason of the heavy national debt, when they themselves owe a large one, contracted in the common cause, can't be thought an unreasonable thing, nor if asked, could it be called an immodest request. Colonial jurisdiction of taxation, long established, led Americans to believe Parliament did not have the right to pass such legislation. Britain had maintained salutary neglect, not enforcing laws that impacted trade, which made the Sugar Act surprising. The Stamp Act of 1765 required proof of tax payment on various paper products. Britain ordered payments made in gold or silver, making the tax more of a hardship. Colonists began printing protest materials despite the tax and burned public officials in effigy. They destroyed a possible future tax office location and attacked the homes of tax collectors and other officials in Massachusetts. Many condemned the violence. Outrage continued, so delegates from 9 colonies attended the Stamp Act Congress. 27 representatives from 9 colonies debated taxation and how to respond. The meeting created the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which pointed to the importance of trade and Parliament's unfair actions. The delegates explained their devotion as British citizens by writing that His Majesty's subjects in these colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm, and all due subordination to that august body, the Parliament of Great Britain. Pointing out their disagreement, they mentioned that His Majesty's liege subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and privileges of his natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain, that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted rights of Englishmen that no taxes should be imposed on them, but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. In the document, they also included their disapproval of interference with trade and the infringement of the right to a jury, reaffirming their ability to petition the king. After Grenville's dismissal in 1766, the new Prime Minister, Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquess of Rockingham, pushed for repealing the Stamp Act and the passage of the Declaratory Act. Parliament struggled with the monarchy for multiple generations, such as during the English Civil War, to become the voice of authority in the British system. The Declaratory Act reaffirmed Parliament's ultimate power over the colonies. Edmund Burke pointed out in Parliament that as English citizens, Americans had justification for anger in how Britain treated them. Sympathizers like Burke floated the idea of allowing the colonies to pay a lump sum to help support their defense. But even these outliers believed Parliament had the final say. Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, proposed new tax legislation in 1767. A duty on paint, tea, china, lead, and glass further angered Americans. Many encouraged New Englanders to boycott British products. Mobs attacked stores that failed to comply, and 2,000 British troops arrived in Boston. Skirmishes took place, most notably the Boston Massacre in 1770, when colonists harassed soldiers, who then fired upon them, killing 5. The following month, Parliament repealed the Townshend Act except for the duty on tea. Committees of correspondence began in 1764 to support communication between colonists, but received long-standing support by 1772. Educated elite with more radical opinions from throughout the colonies began communicating. Letters, pamphlets, and newspapers gave way to public speeches at gatherings, expressing Enlightenment ideals about self-government and liberty. In 1773, the Tea Act cut taxes for the British East India Company, making their product cheaper than the tea the colonists smuggled. The Sons of Liberty, disguised as Native Americans in December 1773, boarded 3 East India ships and threw their tea overboard. Parliament retaliated, and in 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts or Intolerable Acts, as the colonists called them. The various legislation closed the port of Boston and revoked Massachusetts' right to self-government. The Quebec Act extended its authority into the Ohio River Valley, and the Quartering Act required colonial support for military barracks. People in New England and Virginia reacted angrily as their movements westward seemed more restricted, and suspicion grew since Parliament favored the French Catholic region to the north. The First Continental Congress met that same year, proposed forbidding imports and exports from Britain, refused to comply with the Coercive Acts, and endorsed a plan of resistance. Delegates from 12 colonies approved raising militias but rejected creating a colonial parliament. They passed the Declaration of Rights, which pledged their loyalty and to resolve the issues. They included that they are entitled to the benefit of such of the English statutes as existed at the time of their colonization, and which they have by experience respectively found to be applicable to their several local and other circumstances, that the keeping a standing army in these colonies, in times of peace, without the consent of the legislature of that colony, in which such army is kept, is against law. The Congress also approved the Suffolk Resolves, which permitted militias of New England to begin war preparations. British redcoats marched on Lexington and Concord to seize weapons, resulting in the first battles of the War for Independence before Congress declared breaking with Britain. After the battles, the Second Continental Congress met. It placed all the colonies in a state of readiness, organized rifle companies, and recognized the Continental Army, eventually appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Knowing all colonists, including those in the mid-Atlantic and South, did not share New England's passion, John Dickinson proposed the Olive Branch Petition, expressing cooperative sentiments to King George III, such as, "The union between our mother country and these colonies, and the energy of mild and just government, produced benefits so remarkably important, and afforded such an assurance of their permanency and increase, that the wonder and envy of other nations were excited, while they beheld Great Britain rising to a power the most extraordinary the world had ever known." The king refused to read the document and declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. Continuing to meet, Congress tasked a committee of 5 to write a Declaration of Independence on June 11, 1776. Congress approved the Lee Resolution, which stated that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. On July 4th, Congress approved the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. The founders included the purpose of their declaration, their ideas of proper governance and how to respond if it failed those aspirations, a list of grievances, and their response to those complaints with independence. In Europe, the document seemed to go relatively unnoticed, but the British prepared an official stance, including what representatives should say to the colonists. Critic Jeremy Bentham commented, "The mouth of faction, we may reasonably presume, will be closed. The eyes of those who saw not, or would not see, that the Americans were long since aspiring at independence, will be open. The nation will unite as one man, and teach this rebellious people that it is one thing for them to say, the connection which bound them to us is dissolved, another to dissolve it. That to accomplish their independence is not quite so easy as to declare it, that there is no peace with them, but the peace of the king, no war with them, but that war, which offended justice wages against criminals. We too, I hope, shall acquiesce in the necessity of submitting to whatever burdens, of making whatever efforts may be necessary, to bring this ungrateful and rebellious people back to that allegiance they have long had it in contemplation to renounce." The once peaceful relationship ended due to the parliamentary encroachment onto the colonial legislature's authority, despite many gestures of cooperation. The fighting had already begun, and 7 years would give way to independent states. I'm Mr. Frederick Scott Smith. Have a good day. I know I will.